The rain came softly at first, like a whisper over the sleeping city, before the sky broke open and poured its grief upon New Orleans. The French Quarter's iron balconies shimmered under trembling drops, and the street lamps glowed like lonely halos in the mist. Somewhere among them, a man walked without an umbrella, letting the storm wash over him as if penance could be earned through drowning. Ethan Caldwell hadn't felt dry in months, not since the night of the accident. 6 months had passed, yet every breath still carried the ache of what he'd lost. The wife whose laughter had once filled their home like morning sunlight, and the infant daughter who never took her first breath. The world called him lucky, a 37-year-old tech visionary whose cloud computing company had changed the way cities breathed and businesses pulsed. But wealth had never felt so meaningless, and time had never felt so cruel. Tonight, he walked through the storm in a charcoal suit that clung to his skin, collar unbuttoned, shoes ruined by puddles. His reflection rippled in every rain-slick window, a stranger in expensive fabric and hollow eyes. He wandered without purpose, past jazz bars and shuttered bakeries, past lovers huddled under awnings, past warmth he could no longer feel. Lightning cracked across the Mississippi, briefly illuminating the scar along his jaw, the one the doctors said was minor, the one that reminded him he had lived when the people he loved most had not. Ethan stopped beneath the overpass, where the sound of rain striking concrete turned rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It should have been soothing. Instead, it reminded him of the hospital monitor that had flatlined at dawn. He remembered the smell of antiseptic, the way time had fractured, the impossible stillness of his wife's hand in his. "You have to move on," people kept telling him. His investors, his friends, even his therapist. As if grief were a switch one could simply flip off. But Ethan didn't want to move on. Moving on meant leaving them behind. And so, he chose the rain, the one thing that still felt alive enough to touch. He tilted his head back and let the water sting his face, his lips parting slightly in something that might once have been prayer. "Forgive me," he whispered to no one and everyone. A passing car splashed his legs with muddy water, and he barely noticed. Across the street, a flickering diner sign buzzed. Roux's 24-hour café, the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and mercy. Through the fog glass, silhouettes moved slowly. A cook flipping pancakes, a woman wiping tables, a young couple sharing pie and laughter that made Ethan's heart clench. He almost kept walking. He always did. But something in the corner of that window caught him. A flash of color, maybe, or movement. It was gone before he could name it, but it tugged at something buried deep, something that hadn't stirred since the funeral. He couldn't explain it, only that his feet changed direction on their own. He pushed open the door. The bell chimed softly, releasing the smell of rain and nostalgia into the air. Conversations paused for half a second, long enough for strangers to register the soaked figure standing in the doorway. Then the world resumed, spoons clinking, jazz murmuring through an old speaker, the cook calling for more butter. Ethan sat at the counter. The waitress, her name tag said Darla, handed him a towel and a look that said she'd seen worse. "Coffee? Please. Strong? As strong as you've got." The cup arrived steaming, black as midnight. He wrapped his hands around it like a relic, letting the heat seep into his bones. Outside, thunder rolled low and endless. Inside, life continued in small, ordinary ways. A trucker laughed at his own joke. Someone hummed. Someone sighed. The simplicity of it all hurt in the most unexpected way. For a fleeting second, Ethan imagined what it would be like to belong to this world again, to smile at a stranger, to talk about nothing, to eat pie at 2 in the morning just because it was there. But grief didn't loosen easily. It clung to him like the wet fabric on his back. He took a sip of the coffee and exhaled, his reflection faint in the window beside him. Outside, the rain intensified, erasing the edges of the world. It was there, in that blurred silence, that something shifted, an almost imperceptible promise in the air, as if the storm itself whispered, "You are not finished yet." Ethan didn't know that this very rain, the one that had become his confessional, was also leading him toward the beginning of something miraculous. He didn't know that before dawn, he would meet a woman whose strength would challenge his grief, and whose gentleness would rewrite his definition of love. He only knew the storm felt different tonight. Maybe the heavens were tired of crying alone. If you're here with me, feeling the heartbeat of this story beneath the rain, pause for just a moment. Let's walk this journey together. Tell me what you feel when you imagine Ethan standing under that storm. Sorrow, hope, maybe both. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Your words keep this story alive. And if you wish to follow where the rain will lead, to grace, to healing, to the light that waits beyond loss, stay close, follow this channel, and let your heart be part of this tale. Because sometimes the smallest act of listening or a single click of connection is how new stories are born. The night is not over yet. The rain has only begun to tell its truth. The streetlight at the corner of Chartres and Ursuline wore a trembling halo, its pale ring of gold fighting the storm as if tenderness could outlast the wind. Beneath it, a woman stood with a stroller the color of twilight, faded denim, mended seams, wheels that squeaked like tiny violins needing rosin. The rain had slicked her curls into dark, glistening ropes against her temples, but her spine held a quiet nobility, the kind that survives when everything else is pawned away. Grace Holloway did not belong to the rain. She only borrowed it for cover. She had chosen the pharmacy's recessed doorway because the awning still remembered how to shelter. The sign above blinked, closed in red as steady as a heartbeat. In the stroller, her sons, Micah and Malcolm, 9 months old, lay like twin embers wrapped in thrift store blankets, their breaths fogging the thin plastic shield she'd taped to the hood. One grumbled in his sleep, the other sucked on his thumb with solemn concentration, as though duty-bound to quiet the night. "Almost done, baby," Grace whispered, touching a tiny sock with the back of her finger. The pads of her fingers were rough from scrubbing floors at the shelter, yet her touch moved like silk. Mama's going to figure it out. She had learned to say the promise as if it were fact. In another life, she had taught children to breathe on cue and shape their mouths into round bells of sound. "Again," she would tell them, clapping softly, "let the note rise and land gently." She had conducted choruses through winter concerts and spring musicals, watched shy kids open like windows. When the budget slashed the arts, the principal's voice had trembled. "I'm so sorry, Miss Holloway." The box of sheet music had been heavier than she'd expected. Now music lived in the hustle of her days, the hushing rhythm of the shelter's laundry room, the percussive roll of strollers over sidewalk seams. Lullabies hummed almost silently in the back of her throat so as not to invite attention. Pride was a good choir robe. It kept you warm in front of the crowd. But the rain did not care for costumes. It seeped through every thread. She watched a group of friends trot past under a single umbrella, their laughter helium light. A man in a saint's cap dropped a damp dollar into her palm without making eye contact. A woman in a business suit slowed, met Grace's gaze for a heartbeat, then moved on with an apology that only her shoulders knew how to speak. Grace gathered the coins she'd collected, the constellation of someone else's pockets, and counted what was missing. Not much. And yet, tonight, everything. Formula was locked behind glass now. Theft had taught the world to bolt compassion. The clerk would open the case with 2 keys and suspicion. She would pay with this meager offering and carry the heavy tin like an heirloom. She had rehearsed the words for when the shortfall came. "Is there a smaller can? Could you hold this until morning? My ID is at the shelter." The wind pushed water beneath the awning and along the stroller's wheels. Grace shifted a step, a small dance that mothers learn without teacher or mirror. How to be a wall against weather. How to measure the world in ounces. How to swallow pride without choking. She tilted her head and hummed a soft line from Summertime, barely more than breath. Her voice, even thinned by fatigue, had honey in it. A car slowed at the light. A face stared through glass, then drifted away with the green. Grace let the song carry her memory where she did not allow thoughts to go in daylight. To the last Sunday she'd worn heels. To the pew where the choir darted harmonies like swallows. To the sensation of a ringless finger that was still learning to be light. Tyrone had been charm and velvet, a melody that began easy and ended in dissonance. He had promised to come back with work, with rent, with love. Promises are cheap when lips are quick. The day he left, he took their last car seat and the extra blanket she kept for hurricanes. She had learned then that storms could start without clouds. A bus hissed to a stop across the street and exhaled a handful of passengers. One man stepped down alone, bareheaded despite the rain. He had the posture of someone who'd once known where he was headed and could not remember the destination anymore. He walked as if the city were a question, and his body the exhausted answer. Grace noticed him the way one notices distant thunder, present, rolling nearer, and then turned back to the twins. She tucked Malcolm's blanket under his chin. Micah's lashes fluttered at the brush of her thumb. "Stay sleeping," she murmured. "Mama's got work to do." She set the small paper cup, styrofoam trimmed to a ring, because asking for a whole cup felt like a sin, on the ledge near the door. Her sign was written on the back of a discarded shipping label in neat, teacher's letters that the rain had smudged into rivering ink. "Formula for my boys. Anything helps. God bless you." The words embarrassed her, not for their plea but for their nakedness. She had always believed need should be sung in community, not whispered to the passing feet of strangers. But community had turned itself thin this year, and feet do what they can. A gust lifted the hem of her coat and flung spray into her face. Grace blinked and laughed, soft, incredulous, at the absurdity of tears that could not be distinguished from weather. She reached into the pocket for her last dry napkin and found instead a bit of folded paper, her own handwriting, a scrap pulled from an old composition notebook, a 4-bar melody she'd jotted on a bus, the beginning of a lullaby she wanted to finish when life allowed. She pressed the paper to her lips, tucked it deeper for safekeeping. Some women wore lockets. She wore unwritten songs. The man from the bus had crossed the street without her noticing. He stood now at the mouth of the awning's shadow, rain trailing from his jaw to his collar like a rosary of water. His eyes were the kind that looked at a person rather than around them. Not greedy, not pitying, just present. Presence, Grace knew, is rarer than coins. They regarded one another for a moment that stretched and thinned like warm sugar. Behind him, the diner's sign flickered. Beside her, Malcolm sighed in his sleep. The world cinched itself small enough to hold the 4 of them. The man, the woman, the twins, and the rain that kept insisting on washing everything clean. "Evening," he said, voice low, careful, as though sound might startle the babies. "Evening," she returned. Up close, he was handsome in the haunted way of old photographs. Not beauty precisely, but depth, the kind of face you trust with secrets because you can tell it already holds some. He glanced at the stroller, then at her sign, then back to her eyes. "How old?" 9 months, Micah and Malcolm. "Good names," he said. "They deserve good things." Something tightened, then softened around his mouth. "They do." Silence settled, but it wasn't empty. It held a table set for words, waiting to see who would take a seat. He shifted, as if to step forward into that shared space, and she felt the familiar bristle rise in her, pride standing guard over dignity. She didn't want a rescuer. She wanted a chance. I don't. She stopped, annoyed with herself for stumbling over the grammar of need. "If you have advice about shelters, I know them. If you have judgments, I've heard those too. I'm just trying to feed my sons." The man nodded, chastened not by her sharpness, but by the truth inside it. "I don't have judgments," he said, "only questions. And a dry place we could sit a while if you'd like. There's coffee." He gestured toward the diner across the street, where steam ghosted the windows like breath on glass. "You and the boys could warm up." Her first instinct was refusal. The world teaches women to decline before danger has the chance to disguise itself as kindness. But the night was long, and the twins would wake hungry, and the rain had begun to angle sideways with new resolve. And there was something in his voice, an unpracticed tenderness, that eased the hinge of her hesitation. "Coffee doesn't buy formula," she said. It wasn't a no, but it wasn't surrender. "No," he agreed, "but maybe tonight we start with warmth. Then we figure out the rest." A taxi barreled through a puddle, flinging a silver sheet that nearly reached the stroller. Without thinking, he stepped in front of it and took the splash across his suit, as if his body could be an umbrella. Grace swallowed a smile that surprised her with its sweetness. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ethan." He seemed startled by how intimate it felt to say it aloud. Ethan Caldwell. She weighed the syllables, noting what they meant in the city, only how they sounded. Solid. Plain. The name of a man who might keep his word. "I'm Grace," she said. "Grace Holloway." For a heartbeat, the rain, the diner, the whole restless city drew a breath and held it. Grace. He looked at her as though the name had found him, rather than the other way around. "Well, Miss Holloway," he said softly, "may I carry one end of that stroller?" Pride lifted its head once more, then stepped aside for love. "You may carry the door," she replied, and a flicker of humor brightened the lamplight between them. He smiled, a small, imperfect thing that nevertheless looked like sunrise beginning. Together they angled the stroller into the rain's edge. The streetlight poured its pale blessing across their shoulders, and the door to Rue's 24-hour café swung open with the gentle chime of a bell, admitting a woman who would not beg for long, a man who had forgotten how to hope, and two sleeping boys who were about to teach them both the rhythm of a different life. Rue's 24-hour café welcomed them with a sigh of heat and cinnamon. The bell's gentle chime folded behind them, and at once the storm became a distant percussion, softened by glass, by steam, by the low murmur of a trumpet from the radio. A waitress appeared with a practiced kindness that knew when to speak and when to let warmth do the talking. She fetched a corner booth, one armrest dented by years of elbows, and wiped it twice, as if blessing the vinyl. Ethan held the door while Grace maneuvered the stroller through the narrow aisle. The twins slept on, untroubled by geography so long as the nearness of their mother traveled with them. She slipped into the booth first, checked both small faces with a touch that could read temperature, sorrow, and hunger at once, then exhaled the breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Ethan sat opposite, suddenly aware of his wetsuit darkening the seat, of the awkwardness of his hands with nowhere to belong. "Coffee?" the waitress asked, already pouring. "And for you," she turned to Grace. "Hot water, please." And Grace paused, measuring the contents of her wallet against the needs she couldn't fit inside it. "If there's a bowl of oatmeal, with the price on the board, not the fancy one." The waitress's eyes flicked toward the stroller. "We have a plain bowl that's off menu. Comes with sliced banana when we've got it. Tonight we've got it." "Thank you." Grace lowered her gaze, not to hide embarrassment, but to make space for gratitude. Ethan watched the exchange, learning the grammar of her pride. She asked for what she could carry without debt. He lifted the laminated menu and pretended to read, even though the page wavered. He felt clumsy inside his body, too tall for his grief and too small for the sudden tenderness that had wandered in from the rain. "Do you live near here?" he asked. The question sounded simple and wrong at once. "Near enough." Grace wrapped her fingers around the ceramic cup the way a singer holds a microphone, close, careful. "St. Bridget's Shelter. They let me do the evening laundry for extra hours." "The one on Burgundy?" he said. She nodded. "The washers have a tilt that makes them sound like old gospel," leaning into the last note. A smile ghosted across her mouth, shy of staying. "The babies like it. They fall asleep to the rhythm." "Oatmeal for the lady," the waitress announced softly, setting the bowl down as though it were precious china. "Banana on the house, and if the little fellas wake, we've got applesauce." Grace swallowed, then did something that surprised even herself. She accepted. "If they wake," she said, with a polite nod that translated to, "You have seen us." They ate the way people do when food is both necessary and ceremonial, spoon by spoon, with a reverence that made time gentle. Ethan broke his biscuit and pushed half toward Grace without comment. She pretended not to notice until she did, splitting it again and sneaking a quarter to her napkin, where hungry would find it later. "You said your name was Ethan Caldwell," she ventured. "You look like you've carried it a long time." "I suppose I have," he said, surprised by the accuracy. "And you're Grace," which feels like something I shouldn't say out loud too often, in case the word expects me to deserve it. Her eyes lifted, steady. "Grace isn't a wage. It's a weather. It comes, whether you've earned it or not." A single laugh escaped him, unrehearsed, small, almost boyish. The sound startled them both, as if a window had opened by itself. They let the rain fill the spaces that words did not. The radio shifted from trumpet to piano, an old standard draped in velvet. Somewhere near the grill, a timer dinged. Somewhere near the door, a couple left a constellation of wet footprints that shone like coins. The café held them the way a hand holds a bird, firm, but with room for breath. Ethan studied the condensation on his glass, then dared the question that had been leaning against his throat. "Grace, do you have anyone, family, a friend, who can help?" She shook her head. "My mother is in Baton Rouge. We love each other better from a distance. Friends. I had a school once. Students who called me Miss Holloway and learned to sing on their lungs instead of their throats. Music makes a family for 50 minutes at a time." She tucked a curl behind her ear. "The budget cut us before Christmas." "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in the large way and the small. She considered him across the table, the wetsuit, the hands that couldn't decide between stillness and offering, the eyes that looked like someone had left a porch light on for too long. "And you?" she asked softly. "Do you have anyone?" He could have said investors or colleagues. The city knew those answers by heart. Instead, he told the truth that lives under obituary ink. "I did," he said. "They are not here." He swallowed. "The house is very quiet." Grace didn't reach across the table. She didn't speak a consolation that would clatter between them like dropped silverware. She did the most human thing. She listened without moving, and her stillness told him his sorrow didn't need to shrink to fit. One of the twins stirred, the soft animal sound of a dream slipping. Grace pivoted, a weather vane turning toward what matters. She rested her palm on the blanket, hummed a ribbon of melody barely above silence. The boy settled, mouth searching, then stilled. Ethan watched the mastery of it, the way she lowered the room's temperature with a lullaby that had no notes written anywhere, and something inside his chest obeyed too. "I don't carry cash," he said, and then flushed, not because it was untrue, but because it was beside the point. "I mean, I don't want to insult you by offering, by assuming. I don't know what you need, but I can do more than coffee." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card that was simple to the point of shy. Ethan Caldwell, followed by a number and an email, the way a door holds a keyhole. Grace regarded the little rectangle of permission. "What are you offering?" "A meeting," he said, finding steadiness in specific nouns. "My company is building an education platform. There's a team trying to make music lessons accessible online. They need someone who knows children's voices, not code. Someone who can speak to parents and schools. It's a pilot, small but real. Part-time to start. We can arrange childcare during interviews." He inhaled, a self-checked rush. "If you're willing, if you want it." She looked down at the twins. One tiny hand had escaped the blanket, fingers unfurled as if catching rain. She folded the hand back inside, its warmth answering her palm. When she looked up again, her eyes held a difficult brightness. "I don't want a favor," she said. "I don't want to give one," he replied. "I want to hire the right person. You feel like a right person." Silence returned, but it wore a different coat now, anticipation stitched into the lining. Grace took the card, turned it over, pressed the clean edge against her thumb as if testing a blade that promised not to cut. "All right," she said at last. "A meeting. After I find a way to keep them fed this week." He nodded. "There's a grocery across the boulevard that's open late. I can front the formula now and you can pay me back from your first check. Or never. Your choice." He raised a hand, forestalling offense. "Not charity. A bridge. People forget bridges are meant to be crossed, not owned." She considered him long enough for the waitress to refill their cups. Then she folded, inch by careful inch, into trust. "A bridge," she echoed, "just this once." They finished the oatmeal together, bite by unhurried bite, as the storm tipped from rage to steady murmuring. When they rose, the twins slept on, faith bundled in thrift and lullabies. Ethan held the door and took the night like a shoulder. Grace steered the stroller into the softened dark, and the bell behind them chimed a benediction. On the sidewalk, the rain had gentled to a sift, silver dust over asphalt. The city smelled like new beginnings hiding under old brick. As they walked toward the small grocery with its harsh fluorescent mercy, the river breathed somewhere beyond the warehouses, slow and certain. Grace adjusted the stroller's hood. Ethan matched his steps to hers without thinking. as if they had practiced this duet for years. They did not know the word for what had begun, only that hunger had met kindness and found dignity between them, that grief had found a chair and sat down, that two strangers had chosen a booth in a corner cafe and made, for an hour, something resembling home. The storm had not ended. It had simply moved over to let them pass together beneath the same small roof. Morning arrived like a soft apology, rinsing the city with a thin, forgiving light. The storm had moved on, leaving New Orleans glazed and tender, balconies beaded with dew, cobblestones breathing out the faint perfume of iron and sugar. Ethan woke before the alarm and lay there, listening to the hush that used to be called home. It sounded cleaner today, but emptier too, as if someone had opened a window in his chest and let the weather in. At the edge of his kitchen counter lay a business card with a crease through the middle. His, returned to him in memory rather than object. Grace Holloway. The name moved through him with the steadiness of a hymn. He tried to work. He tried to forget the way she had tucked a blanket around a small hand, the way her voice had coaxed sleep out of a storm. He lasted until noon. By 2 o'clock, he was in the office, standing before a glass wall that reflected his life back at him. Floors that shone, plants that never wilted, a piano in the corner that had not been touched since the accident. The team building the music program waved him in to review wireframes and lesson flows. He nodded where he should have nodded, asked questions that were the right shape but the wrong weight. When he said, "We need someone who understands children's breath support," the room blinked. He realized with an awkward heat that he had already imagined the person who would answer. "Alina," he said to his assistant when the meeting was done, "can you make a call for me? St. Bridget's Shelter on Burgundy. Ask for the volunteer coordinator. Tell them I'd like to help with evening service. No press, no donations, just hands." Her eyebrows arched, surprised but not unkind. "Tonight?" "Tonight," he said, and felt something unclench, like a belt pulled one notch looser. St. Bridget's wasn't a place you found unless you were looking. The brick row house wore an old convent's dignity. Paint scuffed by faithful use, doorbell taped with a handwritten, "Please knock." Inside, the air held a fragrance of disinfectant braided with onions and bay leaf. A bulletin board cataloged the city's particular mercies. AA schedules, legal aid hours, a flyer for a free clinic whose copier had left a shadowed line down the middle. Mr. Caldwell? The volunteer coordinator, Ms. Dupree, silver hair tucked into a scarf the color of ochre, extended a hand that had organized more than one miracle. "We're glad for the help. Aprons are by the sink. We don't do cameras. We do casseroles. Sound fair?" "Fair," Ethan said, and tied the string at his waist. Work is a balm when it asks your body to remember what it can carry. He ladled red beans, wiped tables, stacked plastic trays into obedient towers. He learned the names of regulars, their jokes, the way hunger wears different faces and still looks familiar. In the laundry room, he found the tilt in the washers and smiled when the cycle slipped into a rhythm that was, indeed, a little like gospel leaning into a last note. He didn't see her until late, when the line thinned and the rain outside remembered it had somewhere else to be. Grace stepped in with a stroller, and the kind of fatigue that fits like a sweater you can't take off. One twin slept, the other blinked with the wise solemnity of 9 months. She carried herself as she had under the streetlight, measured, steady, unwilling to confuse gratitude with surrender. She recognized him immediately, though he wore an apron instead of a suit, and her eyes startled, then steadied. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, and he realized how different his name sounded shaped by her mouth. Less headline, more human. "Ethan," he corrected softly. Ms. Dupree greeted Grace with the warmth reserved for those who have earned it by degrees. "You're just in time for the last spoonfuls. The kitchen tried to make the beans sing tonight." "They always do," Grace replied, and then to Ethan, "So you volunteer now." "I needed to be where dinner matters," he said, unsure whether the confession would land as he meant it. It seemed honest. She studied him for a breath. "Honesty is rarer than beans," she said at last, and a corner of her mouth tipped. The evening unfolded in small, right acts. Grace fed Micah and then Malcolm, with the precision of someone who can measure out hope in ounces, who knows the exact moment to tap the bottle, adjust the angle, hum the measure that says you are safe. Ethan cleared a tray from her table and replaced it with a napkin folded into a triangle, as if depicting a roof. The gesture embarrassed him as soon as he did it, but she saw the humor and let it live. The first, he nodded, chastened, and quietly grateful. The second evening, he didn't offer. He asked if there was anything on the posted list he could pick up before next week. Size 4 diapers, hypoallergenic wipes, unscented detergent. He brought those things 3 days later, unbagged and without ceremony, left at the office with Ms. Dupree's signature. When Grace thanked him, she did it with the formal grace of a note written in a careful hand that did not ask for an answer. Trust arrived the way dawn does in winter, later than you want, earlier than you fear, soft enough to miss until the room is changed. He arranged for the music team to set up a demo in a spare classroom at St. Bridget's so she wouldn't need to cross town for an interview. He insisted they bring childcare. He did not attend. When the team reported back, eyes bright, voices eager, he asked only, "Did you listen?" "We did," Alina said. "She's the one, if she wants to be." On Friday evening, Grace approached the serving window with the posture of someone rehearsing a new role. "The outreach position," she said without preface, as if the words might spook. "It's dignified. I could do it without breaking something important." "I hoped you'd say yes," he replied. "We can start part-time. Set your hours around the twins. There'll be a background check, but we can expedite. Your pay will be direct deposit. St. Bridget's can help set up the account. Childcare during training. Health coverage once you pass probation. You'll advise on curriculum. Talk to schools. Help us not be foolish." Her eyes grew bright in that difficult way, and for a second she looked 18, hope wide and unsure how to stand in such open light. "You say we as if I'm already inside the room." "You are," he said simply. "The work needs your voice." A thunderhead was building west of the river, throwing a far-off flicker across the windows, but the air inside the shelter felt gentle, like a breath you don't have to borrow. Grace glanced at the twins. Micah yawned so enormously it looked like an opera. She laughed, the sound low and true. "We'll try," she said. "We'll try to be useful." The night they finalized her schedule, he walked out with a trash bag for the curb and paused at the threshold. The city smelled like wet magnolia and streetcar sparks. Grace stood by the doorway, one hand on the stroller handle, the other tucking a blanket. For an instant, the fluorescent light carved a shawl over her shoulders. He saw not a woman in need, but a conductor at the end of a concert, holding a silence so beautiful the audience didn't dare break it. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Good night, Miss Holloway." They were surnames again, but gentler now, like titles bestowed by respect, not distance. As she turned toward Burgundy Street and he toward Rampart, the city settled between them, warmer than it had been the week before. The rain had taught them to bow their heads. The clear sky taught them to lift their eyes. And somewhere, beneath the ordinary noise of wheels and footsteps, another sound began to thread its way through. The first careful notes of a harmony neither had expected to hear again. By the time the calendar slipped into November, the city had traded its heat for a gentler kind of ache, the kind that smells like rain on old brick and carries the faint promise of change. Ethan had begun visiting the outreach office every other afternoon, not to supervise but to linger under the guise of checking progress. No one questioned him. The staff were too busy turning code into empathy and budgets into opportunity. Grace's desk stood near the tall windows, where sunlight caught in the dust like suspended applause. Her workspace was small, practical. A laptop, a spiral notebook filled with meticulous notes in looping handwriting, a framed photo of the twins, and a chipped mug that read, "Teachers do it with class." The mug made Ethan smile every time he passed it, because it felt like proof she had brought something real into a place that often confused efficiency with heart. She worked differently from everyone else. When the programmers grew tangled in their own jargon, Grace would remind them, "A child doesn't care about the back end. They care that the piano sounds like their grandmother's living room." Her voice softened the room without effort. Soon, the engineers started asking her for advice that had nothing to do with code. How do you calm a restless classroom? How do you know when a student's pretending to sing? Ethan watched her navigate each question with the steady patience of someone who had earned every inch of her calm. He also watched himself, how he lingered too long in doorways, how his attention leaned toward her even when she wasn't speaking. The line between admiration and affection had grown so thin it was beginning to hum. On a Tuesday heavy with fog, Grace stopped by his office to deliver her weekly progress report. She wore a navy cardigan with one button missing and smelled faintly of cocoa butter and baby lotion, a scent that made the sterile air of his glass tower feel human again. "The app's beta group loves the sing-along feature," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "But we'll need to simplify the rhythm options. Half the kids tap the screen too fast and the interface freezes." Ethan nodded, half listening, more attuned to the way her hands moved when she spoke. Her fingers drew invisible shapes in the air, tiny phrases of music only she could hear. "We'll adjust it," he murmured. "Whatever you need." Her eyes lifted, amused. "You say that about everything, Mr. Caldwell." "Ethan," he corrected, smiling. She hesitated, as if the name itself were a threshold. "Ethan, then." There was warmth in it, unintended maybe, but unmistakable. For a breath, neither moved. He cleared his throat first, the air between them thick with a tenderness neither dared to name. That Friday, she invited him, formally, almost shyly, to visit the outreach pilot at the community center. The twins were in daycare for the first time, thanks to a new partnership she'd arranged. "The children there don't have much," she said, "but they sing like they're made of sunlight." When he arrived, the hall smelled of crayons, disinfectant, and small miracles. Grace stood before a semicircle of children, clapping out rhythm patterns with her hands. "Again," she laughed. "We don't give up halfway through joy." The children echoed her, their little palms beating against the air. Ethan lingered by the doorway, the sound of laughter pushing against the walls of his chest. He had forgotten how joy sounded when it wasn't curated, when it didn't require permission. Grace caught his gaze from across the room. She didn't smile, not exactly. She included him in the moment, which was rarer. After the session, the children scattered like wind-blown confetti. Grace joined him by the piano. "You look like you were somewhere far away," she said softly. "I was," he admitted, "and you brought me back." She met his eyes and held them. "Careful, Ethan. I'm not a cause." "I know," he said. "You're the reason I stopped believing everything was won." That evening, after the children had gone, Grace found herself sitting beside him on the steps outside the center. The air smelled faintly of rain and roasted peanuts from a vendor down the street. She folded her arms against the chill. "You have a good heart," she said, staring ahead. "But sometimes good hearts try to fix things that aren't broken." He tilted his head. "You think I'm trying to fix you? I think you're trying to make sense of why you're still here when they're not," she said quietly. "And helping me makes the math feel easier." The honesty struck him with the softness of truth rather than cruelty. "You're right," he said after a moment, "but that's not all it is. Being near you feels like remembering something I almost lost." Grace looked at him then, not as an employer, not as a savior, but as a man. "You can't rebuild your life out of someone else's survival," she murmured. "I'm not trying to," he said. "I'm trying to build something beside it." Her breath caught. For a long time, neither spoke. The streetlight above them hummed. Somewhere, a train called across the river. She broke the silence first. "If you mean that, you'll have to let me stand on my own. Don't offer what I can earn. Don't blur what I've built." He nodded slowly. "Then let me stand with you, not above you." That simple rearrangement of words settled between them, clean as morning. By winter's edge, the line between charity and connection had nearly vanished, though neither would name it. Ethan began to measure his days not by meetings or revenue charts, but by the quiet intervals when Grace's voice crossed his threshold, bringing reports, laughter, questions, or sometimes silence that said more than language could. She in turn began to see that his kindness wasn't currency. It was contrition turned into care. The man who had once drowned in guilt was learning to breathe again, not by rescuing, but by listening. And she found, to her own surprise, that she wanted him to. On Christmas Eve, the city lights blurred through drizzle. Grace brought the twins to the office party. Small, unpretentious, mostly staff from the outreach wing. Ethan crouched to their height, shook their hands solemnly, and laughed when Malcolm offered him a half-eaten cookie in greeting. When the laughter ebbed, Grace looked at Ethan across the glow of a small tree. She realized that the space between them was no longer defined by need or gratitude, but by choice. Whatever bridge had carried them through the storm now stretched into open ground, and for the first time since that night beneath the rain, Grace Holloway let herself believe that perhaps, just perhaps, love could begin in mercy and still grow beyond it. The cemetery did not so much sit on Esplanade as it hovered there, a pale city above the city, its marble houses the color of old rain. Ethan brought flowers he did not know how to arrange, and a confession he had practiced all morning. The air held that winter clarity New Orleans gives on lucky days, thin, bright, honest. He paused before the small white vault bearing his wife's name, Lydia Rose Caldwell, and beneath it, in letters so careful they seemed afraid of the world, the word daughter. He touched the stone with the back of his fingers, the way one greets a fevered brow. "I don't know the etiquette for this," he murmured, "talking about the living to the dead. It feels indecent and holy at once." The wind moved through the live oaks and made lace of their shadows. His words found courage. "There's a woman," he said. "Her name is Grace. The twins are Micah and Malcolm. She hums to them the way you used to hum to our someday. I thought my heart had become a museum piece, roped off, silent. But when she speaks, the ropes loosen. I feel guilty for saying it, guilty for feeling it, guilty for wanting more than grief." He laughed once quietly at the tidy stack of his sins. "I promised the world I would keep loving you, and I do. But I'm learning love is not a candle you guard alone in a dark room. It's a house with many rooms, and you taught me where the light switches are. If there is any blessing to give, if there's any permission." He stopped, because permission is a word for doors, and the woman he'd married had hated locked ones. He placed the flowers, smoothed a stray leaf, and stood back. Nothing moved, and everything did. Grief did not lift. Grief is not helium, but it stepped to the side so something else could stand beside it. He whispered a thank you he could not define, and left the silent city to the sleeping. Elsewhere, another city was waking. The rawer one built of bus stops and pharmacy lines, and the corridor of an alley no longer than a man's temper. Grace had just picked up a small tin of formula with a coupon the cashier passed to her like contraband. The twins dozed in the stroller, faces framed by knit hats a church lady had made. She tucked the tin into the undercarriage and turned toward Burgundy, her mind running lists. Laundry, lesson plans, whether the outreach budget could stretch to rhythm sticks for the community center. Practical futures. She did not see the shadow until it detached from the wall. Grace, the way he said her name, sweetened at the edges, sharpened in the middle, made adolescence flicker through her body and vanish, embarrassed to be remembered. Tyrone leaned against the brick as if gravity took orders from his smile. The old charm was there, thinner than it used to be, threaded with something that had learned its manners in back rooms and late nights. "Been looking for you," he said, palms open in a pantomime of peace. "Heard you singing for those rich folks now." "I teach children," she replied. Her voice surprised her by staying level. "And I work for my living." Sure you do." His eyes slid to the stroller, softened with an intimacy he had not earned. "How my boys?" "They are not your anything," Grace said too quickly, which is how truth often arrives, tripping over itself to be said. Tyrone's smile scaled back a notch. "Listen, I just need a little help. A loan, 200. I'll get you back, swear on." "No." He pushed off the wall, hands still relaxed, mouth still making the shape of friendly. "A man can't ask the mother of his kids for—" "They are not." She stopped. The alley held its breath. She had learned this lesson before. Arguments are treacherous terrain. They make you step where the other person tries to lead. She backed the stroller an inch, enough to tell her body it still belonged to her. "Move," she said. "We're going home." Tyrone's jaw ticked, a small, snapping metronome. "Home? With who? Mr. Money?" His gaze caught the tin beneath the stroller. "Let me at least carry—" "Don't touch us." A man at the far corner paused, then kept walking. It is hard to tell the difference between two people speaking and one person being cornered when everyone is tired. Tyrone lowered his voice, not to be kind but to be more dangerous. "Don't forget who knew you before them church ladies. I got friends who know friends. Courts listen to biology when they feel like it. You want trouble, Grace? I can be trouble." Fear arrived like a scent, thin, metallic, childhood quick. It lit the old reflexes. Keep the voice soft. Keep the hands where he can see them. Keep the babies sleeping. But fear had met something new in her this year. Something with a teacher's posture. "Go," she said, and did not whisper it. He stood there a few counts longer, as if measuring the worth of a scene. Then he spat sideways, performative contempt, and sauntered off with the exaggerated ease of a man who wants witnesses to think nothing happened. His shadow unhooked from the wall and followed like a well-trained lie. Grace kept her body still until her breath remembered its rhythm. She crouched, palms on the stroller's bar, and laughed once, the laugh a conductor gives when the trumpet enters a bar early. "We're all right," she told the twins, who slept as if dreams had chores. "We're all right." Only when the corner swallowed the last of his footsteps did she move. She did not call Ethan. Pride, yes, but also precision. There are calls one makes to men, and calls one makes to women who sit at desks with pens that sign safety into being. She went to St. Bridget's and asked for Miss Dupree. The older woman listened without interruption, eyes narrowed in the way of people who consider patience a weapon. "You did well," she said. "No engagement. No address offered. You still got that copy of the restraining order we talked about months back?" Grace nodded. They had drafted it in theory, like a drill that seemed overly dramatic at the time. She had filed it away behind immunization records and the twins' birth certificates. "I'll bring it," she said. "We'll write this up now," Miss Dupree replied, already drawing the form toward her. "And tomorrow morning, I'll walk you to the courthouse myself. If he shows here again, our security will escort him off, and the police will be called. You won't face this alone." The word "alone" cracked something that had been keeping its shape out of habit. Grace blinked hard, blinked again, and the world steadied. "Thank you," she said, which is a prayer when the person hearing it knows how to answer. That night, the twins would not settle. Babies sense weather in the human heart. Grace paced the borrowed room in the shelter's family wing, singing low, hums, then words, then just breath in a tune's outline. Through the thin window, the sky over the river pulsed with faraway lightning, a rehearsal for a storm that might or might not arrive. When both boys finally surrendered to sleep, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and unrolled the little scrap of melody she kept in her pocket. She added 4 bars, notes hushed as footprints in a church. The lullaby was changing. It had learned a new interval, the distance between fear and what stands in front of fear. Hands steady, voice steady, eyes refusing to dim. Across town, Ethan sat at his piano for the first time in a year. He laid his hands on the keys, not to play but to prove he remembered where Middle C lived. Lydia's photo watched from the mantel. The house waited without accusing. He pressed one key, then another. The sound was thin and true, like a line thrown across a river to see if it could reach. He thought of the graves and the permission he had not earned but somehow felt. He thought of Grace as he had last seen her, jacket pulled tight, chin lifted enough to declare agency, but not arrogance. He did not know what that evening had cost her. He only knew the city's air had shifted, and when it does, it means the past has decided to visit. In the quiet between 2 notes, he made a decision that startled him with its certainty. He would not rescue, he would not assume, but he would be present, stubbornly, lawfully, with the kind of help that has a paper trail. If ghosts insist on returning, then doors will be locked, lights will be left on, and names will be said out loud in rooms where officials take notes. The rain began again after midnight, light as rumor. It found the cemeteries and the courthouse steps, the alley on Burgundy and the shelter's roof. It moved the city toward morning with the patience of a catechism, teaching it once more how to begin. The night after the courthouse visit, the city's rain returned. Not angry this time, but reflective, as though the sky were learning how to weep gently again. Grace sat by the window of her small room at St. Bridget's, watching the rivulets chase one another down the glass. The twins were asleep in their cribs, soft chests rising and falling in unison, tiny fists curled like commas waiting for the next sentence of their lives. Her encounter with Tyrone still echoed in her nerves like a struck chord that refused to fade. She had done everything right, kept her voice calm, her steps sure, her fear tucked beneath dignity, but even now her body remembered the tremor of proximity. Fear has a scent. Once it's been breathed, It never quite leaves the lungs. She drew the curtain half closed and pressed her forehead to the cool pane. That was when she heard the knock. 3 quiet taps, careful as a question. "Grace?" Ethan's voice, low and steady, carried through the door. She didn't know how he'd found out, though she guessed Ms. Dupree's protective network extended further than expected. Grace opened the door just enough to see him standing there, his hair damp from rain, his hands empty, an intentional emptiness, as though he'd come not to give or to take, but simply to be present. "I heard," he said. "Are you all right?" She nodded. "We're safe. The police took the report. Ms. Dupree was with me the whole time." He exhaled, a sound closer to prayer than relief. "I'm glad." His gaze shifted to the twins behind her, then back to her face. "I should have been there." "No," she said quickly. "You shouldn't have. This isn't yours to fight." Something flickered in his expression. Pain, then understanding. "Maybe not to fight," he said softly, "but to witness, at least. To make sure you don't stand alone." She stepped aside, letting him in. The air between them was tender with restraint. He set his coat over the chair, moved toward the window, and stood with his hands in his pockets, staring out into the rain as if it contained an answer neither of them had learned yet. "I used to believe storms were punishment," he said quietly. "Now I think they're reminders of what's fragile and what still holds." Grace folded her arms, unsure whether to speak. The room smelled faintly of baby powder and the faint sweetness of formula. "I'm not fragile, Ethan." "I know," he said, turning to her. "That's the problem. I forget you don't need saving." She smiled, a tired, real smile that softened her whole face. "Needing someone isn't the same as needing saving." He moved closer, close enough for her to see the small scar near his temple, a remnant from another accident, another lifetime. His presence filled the small room without crowding it. He stopped just short of touching her, as though the space between them were sacred ground. "I don't know how to be near you without wanting to protect you," he admitted. "And I don't know how to let someone near without fearing it'll cost me freedom," she replied. Their words hung there, 2 truths circling each other like wary dancers. Outside, thunder murmured far away, the storm's pulse slowing to something almost domestic. Ethan broke the silence first. "If it ever happens again, you call me. Not because I can fix it, but because I need to know you're breathing. That's all." Grace met his eyes. "I will," she said, though the promise trembled like the edge of a leaf in wind. He nodded, then crouched beside the twins' cribs, studying their sleeping faces. "They look like peace," he whispered. "Their work," she corrected gently, "but worth every bit." He smiled, and something in that smile caught at her, an unspoken reverence, as if he understood that love wasn't the grand declarations, but the small, relentless caretaking. After a moment, she said quietly, "Would you like some tea? It's instant, but it's warm." "I'd like that." She busied herself at the small counter, stirring the powder into steaming water. The kettle whistled softly, filling the silence between them with something that felt almost like belonging. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed, and for an instant the world contracted to that single, accidental touch. It wasn't passion, it was permission. They sat opposite each other, sipping quietly, both pretending to watch the rain while watching the reflection of the other in the window. "Grace," he said at last, "when I first met you under that streetlight, I thought I was helping a stranger. I didn't know I was meeting the part of myself that still believed in beginnings." Her throat tightened. "And I thought you were another man who'd look at me and see a problem to solve. I didn't know you'd stay long enough to see the person instead." The kettle clicked off, forgotten. For a while they said nothing more, because words, once honest, don't always need company. When the rain finally stilled, Ethan rose, setting the cup down with care. "You should rest," he said. "The world can wait until morning." At the door, she stopped him. "Ethan," he turned, expectant. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not for being here tonight, but for staying long enough to let me believe people can mean what they say." He inclined his head slightly, a gesture somewhere between a bow and a blessing. "Good night, Grace." "Good night." When he was gone, the room felt both smaller and safer. Grace returned to the window, her reflection framed by the faint glow of the streetlight below. She could still feel the warmth of his presence, the steadiness of his voice, the strange comfort of being seen without being reduced. And across the city, Ethan drove home through streets slick with silver. The wipers kept time like a metronome to thoughts he couldn't quiet. He wasn't sure what this was becoming: friendship, love, or something unnamed that carried both risk and promise. But he knew that the ache he'd carried for years had changed its key. It no longer sounded like loss. It sounded like hope learning how to speak again. And somewhere in that vast, rain-washed silence, two broken souls, each mended in different patterns, had found the courage to begin colliding softly, without breaking this time. The community center settled into its evening hush the way a choir settles after the last chord, breath releasing, echoes folding themselves into rafters. In the music room, lights were dimmed to a soft amber. A stand-up piano waited under a quilted cover, smelling faintly of lemon oil and old hymns. Outside, the street hummed with the end-of-shift clatter. Inside, the world moved at the pace of whispered lullabies. Micah and Malcolm slept in their double stroller by the radiator, cheeks glazed with the warm shine of deep sleep. Grace tucked a receiving blanket around their legs, then checked the note taped to the door. Door propped, security knows, the way a captain checks the anchor twice. From her phone, a trumpet climbed into the room. Chet Baker, then a switch to Ella, the kind of songs that hold your chin up while admitting the weight. Ethan set two paper cups on the low bench between them. "Decaf," he said. "I'm told it still counts as comfort." "Comfort rarely reads the label," Grace replied, taking hers. The steam misted her lashes. She looked less guarded tonight, or perhaps simply more tired. Exhaustion has a way of lowering the drawbridge. They sat cross-legged on the floor, backs to the piano, the night gathering around them like a shawl. For a while, they let the music say what people wreck with hurry. The twins exhaled in small tandem sighs. A clock clicked. Somewhere down the corridor, a janitor's bucket rattled, then was still. "Tell me about her," Grace said, not looking at him. It was not a demand, more a door cracked to its safest width. "Lydia." He watched his breath fog the lid of his cup, then disappear. "She loves streetcars and white peaches, and the way a late afternoon makes a kitchen holy." She corrected typos in restaurant menus with a pencil she kept in her purse. She laughed at my seriousness and made it impossible to keep. A pause and then softer. "We were married 4 years. She wanted a girl who could whistle on 2 fingers and con the neighbor's dog into tricks. The night," his voice frayed and steadied again. "I used to think if I told the story often enough, it would file itself into a shape grief could stack on a shelf. But every time it's a different animal." "I'm not asking for the accident," Grace said. "Just the living." Then the living was bright, ordinary in the way people worship in private. Coffee exactly the way she liked it, left on the nightstand. Postcards stuck to the fridge with crooked magnets. A sock forever missing its partner because the universe likes jokes. She would hum while she chopped herbs, and I would come in from a meeting and forget what money wanted. Grace smiled into her cup. "You were happy." "We were," he said. Then, after a beat, "I am again sometimes, and then I feel disloyal." "Guilt is grief's superstition," she murmured, "as if loving twice will summon loss to strike you for insolence." He turned to her. "Who taught you to say things like that?" "Children," she said simply. "They confess without believing they're holy for doing it. And my grandmother, who could pack an entire gospel into a proverb." He traced the rim of his cup. "What would your grandmother say about us sitting on a floor after hours, pretending we drink coffee for warmth?" Grace let a small laugh break loose. It traveled the room and settled at his feet. "She'd say the heart recognizes weather. It knows when to bring a coat." "Tell me about yours," he said. The request landed gently, no pry in it. Not the coat, the weather. She leaned her head against the piano's wooden belly, listening as if for a chord still trapped inside it. "I thought dignity meant never asking," she said. "And then the twins came, and I learned dignity means asking exactly enough to keep your children safe, even if the world mistakes it for begging." Her mouth tightened, memory flashing its quick blade. Under that pharmacy awning, I felt like the city could see through my skin. Shame is a bright light. It makes you think you're naked even when you're wearing everything you own. He did not move closer. He kept his hands where she could see them, resting, not reaching. "I saw a woman shielding 2 small lives with her body," he said. I saw strength so loud the rain turned its head. Her eyes shone, then cleared. Tyrone used to bring me flowers when he was good, and silence when he wasn't. I kept both in vases. That's how foolish I was. I watered silence. Ethan's jaw worked. If he returns, he will return, she said. Cowards orbit the light they left. She slid the edge from her tone with a breath. But I'm not alone in the corridor anymore. Ms. Dupree sits with a pen like a sword. Paper can be armor. Paper, he echoed, and people. The trumpet bent a note that sounded like a door unlocking. Grace looked at the twins, as if confirming the world still had reasons. I'm afraid of you, she said, the words plain as bread. Not because of anything you've done, because of how easy it is to lean into the wind of you. Men like you can lift and not notice when they set down. He listened like he had promised he would. And I'm afraid of you, he answered, surprising himself with the velocity of truth. Because when you walk into a room, my bones remember their purpose, and I start to build a future without permission. Her laugh this time was a tender thing. We're quite a pair. We are, he said. I don't want to be your rescue. I want to be your witness. And when the time is right, if it's ever right, your partner. Grace turned that over as carefully as a teacup handed down generations. Witness is a good word, she said. It does not lay claim. It promises to stay until the story finishes its sentence. The janitor's bucket rattled again, then rolled past the door with a polite squeak. The twins shifted in their sleep, and Grace stood, the motion instinctive as breath. She checked their foreheads, pressed a kiss to each curl, and returned to the floor. When she sat, she was closer, still not touching, but within the radius where warmth travels without needing hands. Play something, she said, nodding to the piano behind them. He slid onto the bench and drew the cover back, revealing keys the color of old cream and clean teeth. He placed his fingers on the middle register like a traveler laying a map flat. What came out was simple. 2 chords, then 3. Hesitant at first, then sure. The way a child reads the first page fluently and startles himself into continuing. The melody was not Lydia's. It was not Grace's. It was the narrow bridge between them, strong enough for 2 steps at a time. Grace closed her eyes. That's it, she whispered. That's the place where a day can rest. When he stopped, neither applauded, because some silences are meant to remain whole. He covered the keys and turned to find her watching him, with a softness that was not pity and not quite awe. Recognition, perhaps, of a person remembering his language. I should go, he said, because the clock said rules and the room said tender, and both needed honoring. Tomorrow's early. Tomorrow's possible, she corrected gently. He stood, slid his coat on, and reached for the door. Grace, Ethan. Their names were something like vows, just not the kind bound by law yet. At the threshold he paused, then added, I will never mistake your gratitude for consent, or your need for permission to own you. She nodded, the acceptance precise. And I will never punish you for the care you offer, so long as it stands beside me. They smiled, tired, new, remade. He left, footsteps soft along the corridor. Grace turned off the lamp, tucked the blanket once more around small sleeping legs, and lingered a moment with her palm on the piano's cover. The room held the last of their conversation like a cord suspended, neither resolving nor breaking, only shining in place. Outside, the night breathed a little easier. Inside, 2 people had said the bravest words the living can say to each other. I am here. I see you. Let us proceed slowly, and still proceed. The next morning unfolded in gold. The air over New Orleans was sharp with the first true cool of spring. The city's light had traded humidity for clarity, and the Mississippi shimmered like liquid brass. Grace arrived at the outreach office with her usual calm precision. Hair pinned, lips neutral, the twins already at daycare. But her step carried a hidden exhaustion that only those who've weathered storms can walk through without breaking stride. Ethan noticed. He always did. From his glass-walled office, he watched her cross the floor, pausing to help a new volunteer sort donation files, laughing softly when a toddler on a visiting mother's lap waved sticky fingers at her. There was something in that sound, her laughter, that rearranged the temperature of the room. He had spent the night thinking, though thinking wasn't quite the word. It was more like listening to an inner voice that had found melody again after years of static. Every time Grace's face surfaced in his mind, it carried the same quiet conviction. She deserved the space to dream, not just survive. That afternoon, after the last community call ended, he knocked on her office door. "Come in," she said without looking up. She was editing a grant proposal, red pens skating across paper in elegant loops. "You work too much," Ethan said, leaning on the doorframe. "So do you," she replied, not missing a stroke. He smiled. Touché. When she finally looked up, he caught the faint smudge of fatigue under her eyes, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from the strength of carrying too much alone. He crossed the small room and placed a folder on her desk. "What's this?" "Something that might change everything," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dramatic. Should I brace myself?" "Maybe," he said, half laughing. "Open it." Grace flipped through the folder. Proposal pages, blueprints, a logo sketched in his precise handwriting. The Harmony Project. Her brows knit as she read. "A music program for public schools?" He nodded. "Citywide. Free access for children from low-income families. Funded through our foundation. Supported by the Education Board. You'd be the program director." She blinked, then looked up sharply. "Director? Yes. You design the curriculum, hire instructors, oversee partnerships. It's more than the outreach role. It's leadership. Full-time. With creative control." Her breath hitched. "Ethan, this is enormous. But," she hesitated, her voice thinning, "why me?" "Because it was your idea," he said simply. "You told me children don't just need access. They need art that speaks their language. You said a melody can keep a kid out of trouble longer than any lecture." I listened. Grace's fingers rested on the pages as if afraid the ink might fade. "You listen too well," she murmured. "I built this for the right person to lead it," he said, "and there's only one name I could write there." She pushed the folder away gently, shaking her head. "Ethan, this feels like charity," he finished softly, her lips pressed together. "It isn't," he continued. "It's partnership. You've been the pulse of this program since the first day you stepped into that community hall. This is just me making sure your work has the reach it deserves." Grace stood, crossing to the window. The late sun fell over her like honeyed light over stained glass, tracing the curve of her shoulders, catching the loose tendrils of her hair. "You're asking me to trust an offer that sounds like a miracle. I'm asking you to trust that it's real." She turned, studying him. "You don't know what it's like to have every good thing come with an invisible string. I know what it's like to lose everything and still wake up wondering if you deserve what's left," he said quietly. "We're not bargaining, Grace. We're both just trying to rebuild the same house. Different rooms, same roof." Silence stretched, taut and trembling. The city hummed below them, a brass band rehearsing somewhere distant, the faint call of a riverboat horn. Grace finally said, "If I take this, I take it as a professional, not as someone you rescued, or someone you—" She faltered, unable to finish the word. Ethan stepped closer but stopped an arm's length away. "As someone I respect," he said, "as someone whose vision deserves to live in daylight." She nodded once, firmly. "Then I'll consider it." "Take your time," he said, though his heartbeat argued otherwise. "I'll have legal draft the proposal, but the decision is yours entirely." When he left, the folder stayed open on her desk. Grace sank into the chair and read through each line again, tracing the outlines of her own dreams in someone else's careful handwriting. The thought terrified her, because she wanted it. Not the job, but the faith behind it. Later, she walked home beneath the half-moon. The air was cool, the kind of night that made the city seem half-dream. Every step replayed the conversation. His sincerity, his restraint, the way he said respect as though it were sacred. At the shelter, she checked on the twins. Both slept deeply, hands open on the blanket. Grace sat beside them, the folder balanced on her knees, and whispered, "We might be building something new, my loves. Something that's ours." Ethan stayed late at the office, staring out at the skyline. He thought about how offering hope was riskier than offering money. Money can be repaid, Hope changes the debt entirely. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that she might say no or that she might say yes. At midnight, his phone buzzed. A message. The Harmony Project. Let's talk in the morning. No signature, but none needed. He leaned back, eyes closing briefly, letting the weight of the moment settle. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like an empty corridor. It felt like a doorway waiting to be opened. And in some quiet, unspoken way, both of them understood. This wasn't just an offer. It was the turning point where survival began to resemble destiny. The weeks that followed did not announce themselves with fireworks or declarations. They arrived softly, on the souls of ordinary days. A rhythm formed, one that did not depend on romance for its definition, yet carried the shape of it like a watermark. Mornings began with Grace's hum weaving through the tiled hallway at St. Bridget's, a tune so light it seemed to float the twins from sleep. Micah always woke first, blinking at the ceiling as though reading a secret written there. Malcolm stretched like a cat and smiled at his own yawn. Grace buttoned them into small sweaters the color of breakfast, oatmeal and honey, and whispered a weather report for their day. You'll hear a trumpet at the playground. You'll nap when the sun moves to the far window. You'll forgive the world for being loud. On Tuesdays, Ethan learned the ritual of daycare drop-off. He signed his name carefully on the line, authorized pickup, a formality that felt like a vow. When he knelt to tie a shoe or retrieve a fallen sock, his hands remembered tenderness instead of business. The boys reached for him with the wonder infants afford to sunlight and dependable voices. He never took it as a right, only received it like rain. The Harmony Project unfurled in drafts and conversations, in gymnasiums that smelled of floor polish and possibility. Grace drew curricular maps late at night, the margins filled with small stars and quick reminders. Ms. Alvarez has 6 left-handed students. Add adaptive grips. Mr. Dubois's class responds to call and response. Invite brass band visit. Ethan negotiated budgets with a steadiness that made administrators exhale. He stopped saying, "my program," and started saying ours, without noticing the change. A quiet allegiance grew in the interstices. When a grant portal crashed at 11:58 p.m. and Grace's laptop screen went black, she texted Ethan a single word, "help," and watched as a solution arrived without judgment. When a board member asked if Grace was the heart, while Ethan was the head, they exchanged a glance and answered together, "We both are." The man chuckled, assuming charm. Neither corrected him. Some truths are stronger when left unadorned. There were evenings, too. The best kind were made of nothing. A pot of red beans simmering while rain gentled the windows. The twins banging wooden spoons against a pot in 4/4 time. A dish towel slung over Ethan's shoulder as he learned the choreography of Grace's small kitchen. He chopped celery crookedly. She pretended not to see and then, when he wasn't looking, squared the pieces with 2 quick strokes. "You're improving," she teased. "The onions are crying less." He grinned, eyes watering. Once, the power blinked out across the block and stayed gone. They lit a trio of stubby candles and sat on the floor with the twins between them. The world shrank to the glow that fit their circle. Grace told a story about a field trip to the aquarium, the year she coaxed an entire class to sing to the stingrays. Ethan talked about Lydia's habit of naming their houseplants after jazz musicians. "This is Billy, the pothos that forgives me. This is Thelonious, who thrives on neglect." The names felt less like ghosts and more like invitations to set another plate at the table. Grace listened without tidying the sorrow. When the lights returned, they laughed at the way brightness felt indecent. There were nights when love revealed itself as labor. Micah ran a fever that flushed his cheeks and narrowed the world to one distressed sound. Grace swayed the length of the room for hours, whispering constellations he could follow into sleep. Ethan arrived with ginger ale and a digital thermometer, asked permission with his eyes, then took a shift in the creaking rocker. He kept time with the boy's breath, every rise and fall like the metronome of a heart relearning calm. At dawn, the fever broke. Grace poured coffee into mismatched mugs and looked at him over the steam. "Thank you," she said, not as an obligation, but as a naming. He shook his head. "We're a we," he answered, softly enough that the word could choose its own future. On Sunday afternoons, when the city pretended it wasn't tired, they walked along the levee. The river moved with the confidence of something that had seen everything and survived it. Grace pointed out freight ships by their haunches. Ethan identified the gulls only as loud critics. Sometimes they spoke of nothing, sometimes everything. The mothers who had made them stubborn, the teachers who had shown them mercy, the ways poverty and grief teach the same hard lesson about what is not promised. When the twins slept in the stroller, they let silence be a third companion. It was not empty, it was faithful. Boundaries remained, not as fences but as carefully tended edges. Ethan did not arrive without texting first. He did not offer money when what she needed was time, or time when what she needed was solitude. Grace did not fold him into every difficulty. She trusted him with some burdens and trusted herself with others. There was no scoreboard, only an unspoken agreement to err on the side of dignity. One evening, midway through March, Grace brought him a manila envelope. "For you," she said, oddly formal. Inside lay a sheet of music, hand-copied in elegant notes. A lullaby, hers. The one she had been writing in corners of days. "I finished it on the streetcar," she said, "between Canal and Elysian Fields, where all good endings pretend to be beginnings." He took the page like a fragile photograph and set it on the piano. The melody was simple and brave. He played, she sang. The twins, heavy with sleep, made small noises that sounded like agreement. When the last note thinned into quiet, they remained where they were, filled to the rim with something that did not spill. They never once called these moments love. They did not need to. Love is wild when named too soon. It prefers evidence to adjectives. A fresh pack of wipes in the cabinet before anyone asks. A reserved seat at a school board meeting. A text at 4 p.m. "You ate?" And a photo reply of a lopsided sandwich to prove compliance. It is a hand hovering respectfully over the small of a back and withdrawing when it feels the tremor of caution. It is the bandwidth to learn someone's hesitations and leave them intact. When the Harmony Project signed its first school, they celebrated with paper cups and grocery store cake thick with frosting. Grace looked at the contract, at her title, Program Director, and felt the ground steady beneath her in a way no promise ever had. Ethan watched the light pass across her face and understood that the holiest thing he could do was nothing. Stand there, witness, keep still while a woman walked into a room she built. On the night he took her and the twins to a small diner near the river, the waitress slid crayons across the table. "For the boys," she said. But it was Grace who drew. A crooked rowboat with 3 figures, then a 4th added in a different color. She hesitated, laughed at herself, and shaded the river with quick blue lines. Ethan lifted his coffee. "To ordinary," he said. She clinked her water against his cup. "To the kind of ordinary that saves lives," she answered. The city outside went on, insisting upon itself. Sirens, church bells, barges honking like geese. Inside, 2 adults and 2 children shared a table sticky with history, the kind that leaves a sweet residue on the fingers. No one made a speech. No one asked for a definition. The moment wrote its own. Love, in the quiet, taking attendance and finding everyone present. Spring had found its full voice by the time Ethan decided to host a small dinner. The Harmony Project's first pilot school had launched without a hitch, and Grace insisted that milestones, even modest ones, deserved acknowledgement. "We don't celebrate enough," she'd told him. "We work, we survive, we pray, and then we forget to notice joy when it's sitting in the next chair." So, he'd open the doors of his townhouse again, those heavy oak doors that hadn't known laughter in years, and filled the kitchen with the scent of rosemary chicken, cornbread, and soft jazz. The twins toddled between the guests, squealing when Grace's colleagues lifted them high or pressed kisses to their cheeks. Ethan watched from the doorway, wineglass in hand, realizing he couldn't recall a single moment in which his house had felt this alive. That was when the knock came, sharp, deliberate, and too polite to belong to a neighbor. Grace looked up from the dining table. "Expecting someone else?" He hesitated. "No." But his chest tightened with a strange premonition. When he opened the door, the scent of Chanel No. 5 and cold air swept in. On the stoop stood Margaret Caldwell, his mother, immaculate in a cream coat and pearls that caught the porch light like frost. "Hello, Ethan," she said, Her voice was a blade wrapped in silk. For a heartbeat, he couldn't speak. "Mother, you didn't say you were coming to town. I wanted to surprise you." Her gaze slid past him into the hall, where laughter rippled and a child's giggle rose like a bell. "It seems I succeeded." He stepped aside because old reflexes still knew obedience. "Come in." Margaret entered with the composed grace of a woman who had never been uninvited anywhere. The party's sound dimmed. Grace turned, smiling automatically at the newcomer, until she saw Ethan's expression. "Grace," he said quietly, "this is my mother." Margaret's eyes took her in the way collectors assess an artifact. Detail first, value second. She nodded once, tight. "I've heard the name." "Mrs. Caldwell," Grace said, offering her hand. "It's good to meet you." Margaret looked at the hand but didn't take it. "And you are an employee of the foundation, I understand." The air thinned. Ethan moved to intervene, but Grace, ever composed, withdrew her hand gently and replied, "I am the director of the Harmony Project. Ethan and I work together." "Ah," Margaret's smile sharpened. "How admirable. He's always had a charitable streak, though I must say, this is the first time I've seen him pursue it so personally." The words landed like a slap. The twins, sensing the change in atmosphere, grew restless. Grace bent to soothe them. "Mother," Ethan said, voice clipped, "you're being rude." "I'm being curious," she corrected. "Your father and I built our lives to ensure you'd never need to play savior for others. Yet here you are, dining with," she gestured toward Grace, "a woman from a shelter and children who are not your own." "Enough," he said, but Margaret was not a woman easily silenced. "You've lost too much to be careless, Ethan. Your grief made you vulnerable. I can understand that. What I cannot understand is mistaking sympathy for love." Grace rose slowly, dignity cloaked around her like a prayer shawl. Her voice was calm, even kind. "Mrs. Caldwell, I assure you, your son doesn't mistake anything. He sees clearly. If that troubles you, perhaps it's because love often does." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You have a clever tongue, and you have a mother's concern," Grace replied, meeting her gaze without defiance. "We can both keep our gifts." Ethan moved between them. "Mother, this is my home. You don't speak to her that way here, or anywhere. You would throw away your family name for this?" "No," he said. "I would honor it by living differently than you taught me." For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then she exhaled through her nose, a faint sound of dismissal. "When your father was dying, he asked one thing, that you remember where you come from. It breaks my heart to see you forget." "I remember exactly where I come from," Ethan said quietly, "and that's why I know where I want to go." Her gaze moved to the twins, two small faces watching from the safety of Grace's skirts. Something flickered there, not quite disdain, not quite curiosity. "They're sweet," she said finally, her tone unreadable. "But they are not your blood." Grace's jaw tightened. Ethan stepped closer. "Blood has never been a reliable measure of family." "Nor has pity," Margaret murmured and turned toward the door. He caught her wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough that she stopped. "I loved Lydia with everything I had," he said. "You know that. But she would have wanted me to keep living, to build something that wasn't just a monument to loss. Grace is not a replacement, she's a reason. And if you can't see that, then perhaps you should leave before you ruin something decent." His mother looked at him for a long time, her face unreadable. "You sound just like your father," she said, which might have been the cruelest thing she could think to say, or perhaps the kindest disguised. Then she freed her wrist and left. The door closed with the softest of clicks. Silence followed, so complete it hummed. Ethan turned back. Grace stood motionless beside the table, her expression caught between fury and restraint. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know she would." "You don't owe me an apology for another person's blindness," she interrupted. Her voice trembled only once. "But it hurts that she looked at my children and saw less than human." "She saw less than herself," Ethan said. "That's her tragedy, not yours." Grace looked down at the twins, one clutching her skirt, the other hiding his face against her leg. She smoothed their curls, steadied her breathing, then lifted her chin. "I've met many kinds of cruelty," she said, The quiet kind is the hardest to forget. He crossed to her and, without touching, stood near enough that she could feel warmth. "I'll make it right," he said. "You already have," she replied softly. "You told her who I was. That's enough." Later, after the guests had left and the dishes cooled in the sink, they sat by the window with the city stretching beyond the glass. Grace leaned her head back against the couch, eyes closed. "She loves you, you know," she said, in her way. "I know," Ethan said, "but love without humility becomes possession." Grace turned to him then, exhaustion easing into tenderness. "Then let's promise never to love that way." He reached for her hand, not to claim, but to agree. "Never," he said. The night held them in its steady dark. Outside, the rain began again, soft and rhythmic, as if the world itself were offering applause for the quiet kind of courage that does not need to be seen to exist. The storm announced itself with a hush rather than a roar, the way a room grows quiet just before someone says the unthinkable. By noon, the sky had slipped from pewter to bruise. A greenish cast fell over New Orleans like a rumor. Grace checked the weather app twice, then a third time out of superstition. "We'll be quick," she told the twins at daycare drop-off, kissing the soft places at their temples. "I'm close if the sky decides to misbehave." At the Harmony Project office, air held the metallic tang of pending rain. Ethan stood at the window, thumb pausing over his phone, as if he could negotiate with weather the way he negotiated with budgets. "Flash flood watch," he said when Grace entered. "The river's not the worry, it's the streets. They'll fill faster than anyone remembers how to swim." "We'll adjust," she said, because that was her talent and her prayer. By 2 o'clock, the rain began its lesson in urgency. It came thick and angled, drove sideways, discovered shortcuts under doors. The gutters forgot their jobs. Leaves clotted in the mouths of drains. The city, faithful as ever to drama, obliged. Alina ducked into Grace's office. "Daycare just called. They're moving kids to the second floor as a precaution. No immediate danger." "Precaution is a good word," Grace said, but her hand had already closed around the strap of her bag. Ethan read her intention in the set of her shoulders. "I'll drive you," he said. "The sedan sits too low, I'll take the old Jeep." He made the offer like a rope thrown across a gap. Not a rescue, an option. They left together into rain that felt sentient. The Jeep waded through streets turned temporary canals. Sirens stitched the distance. A transformer popped and the neighborhood sighed into darkness. At a low intersection, a city bus had stalled. Passengers pressed hands to the windows as if prayer improved traction. "Take charters," Grace said, map reading by instinct. "The daycare's on high ground." "Chartres is flooding from the back," Ethan countered gently. "We'll circle to Esplanade and come in on foot if we have to." They turned and found themselves in a maze of water and decisions. A river always remembers what it wanted to be. The streets made way. When they reached the block, they saw it. The daycare's lower steps swallowed. Staff corralling toddlers with the practiced calm of people who have read the manual for panic and refused its terms. Grace exhaled only when she saw Ms. Valencia, the director, at the door. "Second floor," Ms. Valencia called. "All accounted for." Ethan pulled into a shallow eddy of a parking lot. "I'll try the side entrance," he said. "Less current." He looked at Grace. "We go together." They stepped into water cold as new coin. It rose mid-calf, then higher, tugging at ankles with curious, impolite hands. A floating trash bin brushed past like an uninvited guest trying not to apologize. Grace lifted her skirt, tucked it into the waistband, and moved with measured care, her body remembering parades, hurricanes, all the ways a city asks its people to balance. Inside, the stairwell smelled like damp drywall and children's crayons. A chorus of small voices drifted down, fright and delight in equal measure. On the landing, a toddler sat solemnly with a goldfish cracker held like a sacrament. A teacher coaxed a song from a group whose rhythm refused to be diminished by weather. "Micah and Malcolm?" Grace asked, breath bending. "In the reading corner," Ms. Valencia replied, already counting heads again. "They've been asking for you without crying." It's a miracle and a mystery. Grace found them by the window, cheeks bright with relief at her shape crossing the room. She gathered both, one on each hip as she had learned to do when the world required symmetry. Ethan stood beside her, and leaned his forehead briefly against Malcolm's, a benediction disguised as greeting. Then the siren changed its pitch. Not a city siren, a building one. A strained mechanical bleat that meant the basement had decided to remember it was the lowest place. An older teacher hurried over. Water's climbing faster than the pumps can pretend. We should go while the stairwell still agrees. They formed a line. Staff, children, bundles of backpacks like small shell shields. Ethan took the lead with a group of wobblers. Grace followed with the twins. Ms. Valencia closed the line, matching her cadence to those still learning stairs. On the first flight down, the emergency lights flickered, then steadied into a dream of daylight. They made it to the lobby and found the front door shoved stubbornly by water. It opened only to a slit, enough for a single file of small bodies and big courage. Ethan waited first, one child carried, two holding his belt, a little parade with practical rules. Do not let go. Do not rush. Do not pretend to be brave when you can be careful. Then the thing happened that would become a story retold to measure gratitude against what might have been. As they neared the Jeep, a sudden surge from a clogged storm drain knocked a plastic pallet free. It skittered, turned, and knocked against the back of Grace's knees. She did not fall. Her balance was the choreography of 100 days like this. But one of the twins flung his arms, startled, and the receiving blanket slid, caught water, ballooned. Micah's cry was not loud, but it carried. Ethan spun, crossing the distance in 3 strides, and anchored his hand at the small of Grace's back, not to seize but to steady. "I've got you," he said, not a promise beyond his power, a present tense pledge. Grace adjusted, retucked, and together they moved as a 4-limbed creature across a temporary river. Near the curb, a sedan, its driver misjudging depth, sent a wake that slapped the wheel well of the Jeep and shoved the pallet back into Grace's calf. She lost her footing for a breath, a single terrifying heartbeat of wrong geometry, and righted herself with an animal sound, raw as truth. The twins keened, then quieted at her voice, low and certain. The lullaby she had written now pressed into service as command. "We are okay. We are okay. We are okay." Neighbors appeared the way goodness does, unannounced. A line formed without debate. Hands passed children like precious packages. A woman with forearms like gospel lifted the stuck door wide enough for the last stroller. Someone shouted, "Watch the manhole," and 3 bodies pivoted to avoid it. When the last child climbed into the bus that had finally unstuck itself and reversed to serve as an arc, the block exhaled. They loaded the twins into the Jeep and sat for a moment in the sanctuary of relative dryness. Grace closed her eyes, then opened them, as if confirming she still owned them. Rain speared the windshield. The wipers offered their metronome, dedicated and slightly overwhelmed. "Tell me you're unhurt," Ethan said, voice hoarse with the quiet version of panic. "I'm all right," she answered, and then, less brave, "I was terrified." "Me too." The admission softened the air. He reached across the console and laid his hand palm up on the seat between them, a place to put fear down. Grace placed her fingers there, cooled by rain and warmed by his skin. The contact was neither rescue nor romance, it was recognition. They drove the long way back to St. Bridget's, following the higher ridge. The shelter thrummed with the logistical mercy of organized chaos. Dry towels, hot soup, cots unfolded like tidy promises. Miss Dupree moved through the room, clipboard held like a shepherd's staff. "You brought them all out," she said to Grace, eyes bright with unshed weather. "You did good." "We did," Grace said, tipping her chin toward Ethan, and, beyond him, toward strangers now packing donated diapers into neat pyramids. Later, when the twins slept in borrowed pajamas and the storm's tantrum had tired into drizzle, Grace and Ethan stood in the doorway of the family room. The lights glowed the tired yellow of long day's end. Outside, sirens quieted to their city lullaby. Somewhere, a saxophone practiced the scale of relief. "Another inch and it would have been worse," Ethan said, his hand half raised as if to touch her, then stopping in the air between them, reverent of the newness of this safety. "Another inch," she echoed, and then smiled, small and fierce. "And yet here we are." He looked at her, at the damp curl at her temple she hadn't tamed, at the steadiness that had not abandoned her even when footing had. "You were extraordinary." "I was a mother," she said, "and a woman who knows how to move her weight when the ground argues." He laughed, the sound breaking like sunlight. "May I be something simple and exact?" he asked. "What?" "Proud," he said. "Of you." The word warmed a place in her that had stayed cold out of habit. "Then I'll be something exact too," she answered. "Grateful. For you, for this, for all the hands." They did not kiss. The moment asked for another kind of vow. Instead, he lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to the damp knuckles. An old-world gesture made new by the permission in it. She let him, then withdrew gently, the way one rescues a firefly from a jar and watches it go on lighting. When finally they parted for sleep, he to the cot set up by the men's wing, she to the small family room with the twins, the rain thinned to a whisper. The storm had announced its power and then passed, humbled by a city too practiced in survival to surrender. In its wake, everything ordinary gleamed. A dry sock, a borrowed quilt, the sound of two boys breathing in unison, and the soft acknowledgement between two adults that nearly losing had clarified what they hoped to keep. The floodwater receded as New Orleans always insists it will, reluctantly, leaving a lace of silt on doormats and a new geography of small griefs. For 2 days the city smelled of river and bleach. Volunteers ferried mops like oars. Neighbors compared damage the way veterans compare scars. With humor first, silence later. Grace kept the twins close, monitoring their coughs the way a sailor watches sky and barometer at once. Micah ran hot the first night, just a brush fire of fever, and settled. By morning his breathing sounded like a page turned too fast. She propped his crib mattress on folded towels, kept the window cracked for air that wasn't just air freshener pretending to be pine. Ethan arrived with HEPA filters and a list Ms. Dupree had drafted. Unromantic, necessary things. Saline mist, pediatric doses, advice about mold like a neighbor you cannot evict. He installed the filters while the twins studied him solemnly, as if learning a new liturgy. "We'll have the room assessed tomorrow," he said, wiping his hands. "If there's even a hint of black mold, the shelter will move you and the boys to the new family wing. Paperwork is already in motion." That evening, a breeze shouldered in from the Gulf, salt and forgiveness braided in its edge. Ethan cooked a simple soup on the family wing's small stove. Onions tolerant of his clumsy knife, rice that agreed to behave, chicken that transformed under heat into something like comfort. They ate in the quiet that belongs to people who have just learned what almost means. At midnight, the almost returned. Micah woke with a sound so thin it barely qualified as cry, more a stitched breath that snagged on itself. Grace was up before the sound finished its shape. She lifted him and felt the rapid flutter at his ribs, the small chest working like a bird's. "It's okay," she said, voice even, breath steadying so his might follow. But the inhale came tight, and the exhale came too soon. Ethan was at the door, hair mussed, shoes already pulled on without laces. "What is it?" "Wheezing," Grace said, not looking away from Micah. "It started this afternoon, now worse." She turned the hot tap to run the shower, steam building slow clouds. In the bathroom light, Micah's lips had the faintest dusk at their edges. "We're going." They moved with the choreography fear teaches those who refuse to panic. Diaper bag, insurance card, blanket. Malcolm lifted sleeping and settled into his stroller for Miss Dupree to watch. A note on the whiteboard because courtesy survives terror in the right hearts. Ethan scooped his keys. "Jeep," he said. No time to wait for an ambulance stuck behind other emergencies. The night had thinned to clear. Stars pricked through like stitched forgiveness. The city was awake in the way it always is. Distant sirens, the soft clatter of late workers, a saxophone practicing scales 2 streets over. They drove Esplanade toward the hospital, the route most locals know but never want to memorize. Micah's breaths counted the seconds. Grace held him upright, one palm at his back, the other measuring every rise and fall as if she could argue with physics. At a red light that ignored human urgency, Ethan rolled to a near stop, looked both ways, and took it gently. "We're minutes out," he said, voice low, as if speaking to the traffic itself. He did not say Lydia's name. He did not have to. The past rode shotgun when the present demanded steady hands. Grace hummed, not the lullaby exactly, but its skeleton, the notes that had survived flood and fear and the woman who had written them. Micah's gaze slid to her mouth as though language itself might lend him air. "Almost there, baby," she whispered. "Almost there." The ER doors opened like a mercy rehearsed. Intake questions came crisp and necessary. Forms manifested under pens that had seen too much and still cared. A nurse with a braid like a rope guided them to a curtained bay, fitted a tiny mask, misted albuterol into night made of fluorescent and resolve. The machine hissed the rhythm of reprieve. Micah's shoulders eased one notch, then another. The color at his mouth blushed back from dusk to dusk rose. Ethan stood by the curtain's hem, palms flat against the metal of the IV pole, as if grounding the entire system by will. He watched Grace the way one watches a lighthouse in weather, grateful for the fact of it, careful not to worship. Her voice ran like a small river into the mask. Cadence without rush, comfort without lies. The doctor arrived with gentle eyes and practical sentences. "Reactive airway," she said. "Could be the mold, could be the dust, could be that he's a little boy in a city that keeps teaching lungs new tricks. He's responding beautifully." She listened again, smiled a quiet clinician's smile. "We'll keep you an hour, then home with a nebulizer and close follow-up. You came at the right time." Grace nodded. She had expected to cry. Instead, a steadier thing poured through. Relief's older cousin, the one that stands sentinel after the crisis clocks out. She kissed Micah's hair and looked up at Ethan. In his face she saw the aftershock, the way a body can be perfectly calm while memory shakes inside its bones. "Breathe," she said to him, and the word carried warmth. He exhaled, shoulders lowering. "I keep thinking about how the world can be fine and not fine in the same minute." "That's every minute," she said, and reached to take his hand. She did not lace their fingers. She laid her palm against his, a parallel grace. "He's okay." "Because you knew," he said. "Because we knew," she corrected. They sat like that until the machine's hiss became the sound of something else. Patience, perhaps. When the nurse returned, she carried the kind of instructions that look like orders and feel like mercy. Spacers, schedule, numbers to call, the admonition to sleep. Ethan signed. Grace asked questions the doctor had not yet thought to answer, and together they made a plan ordinary enough to be sacred. Outside, the air felt washed and newer than any day deserved. They drove back through a quiet city that had decided, at least for this stretch of hours, to be kind. In the back seat, Micah slept with the loose-limbed honesty of reprieve. Grace kept a finger on his ankle, as if anchoring him to earth. Ethan kept one eye on mirrors and one on the road, the way all careful men do after they remember how quickly joy can turn. At St. Bridget's, a lamp was on in the family wing's window, Ms. Dupree's promise in electric form. Malcolm, roused briefly, reached for his brother, confirmed his existence, and sighed himself back to sleep. Grace settled Micah, tucked the nebulizer kit on the shelf as if it were both a threat and a friend. The room hummed with filter and fatigue, and the low hum of a city that never truly stops. They stood in the doorway, not yet willing to divide into separate hallways and cots. Ethan looked at her, then at the boys. "I know the word almost too well," he said. "It taught me to fear. But tonight it feels like grammar." It let the sentence finish. Grace's mouth curved. "Then let's write quieter sentences. Fewer commas, more periods, and some exclamation points," he offered, tentative. "When appropriate," she said, warmth flickering at the corners of restraint. He lifted her hand again, not to claim, but to honor. "You were extraordinary." "I was a mother," she answered, and then softer, "and a woman with a partner." The word tilted the air. She had not promised anything beyond this hour, this breath, this lesson learned under fluorescent lights. Yet it rang like a bell, truthful and exact. He did not press it for future tense. He let it live where it belonged. "Sleep," he whispered. "Rest," she countered. They parted, the way people do when they trust the corridor will lead them back. Behind them, The twins drifted deeper into a night that had almost broken and didn't. Ahead of them, morning waited with its usual immodest optimism. Between those two sureties, two adults stood in a doorway and understood, without speeches or rings or any fanfare at all, that near tragedy had given them not drama, but clarity. Some lives do not need saving. They need steady hands at midnight and a car pointed toward the nearest light. The city healed in increments you could miss if you weren't looking. A stoop scrubbed clean. A closed sign turned to open. A trumpet returning to a window it had abandoned during the flood. Grace noticed them all. She had begun to notice recovery the way a music teacher notices a child finally finding the downbeat. Quiet, decisive, ordinary enough to be holy. The Harmony Project moved from sketch to scaffolding. Contracts gathered signatures. Gym floors were taped with measures so children could stand shoulder to shoulder and still feel the room belonged to them. The first delivery of instruments arrived like a parade. Cardboard coffins carrying sleeping clarinets, trumpets with their first gleam, keyboards that smelled faintly of ozone and optimism. Grace stood with a clipboard and a smile that looked more like composure than triumph. "Count them twice," she told the volunteers, "then let the kids smudge them with fingerprints. That's what shines them." Ethan watched her as one watches a lighthouse on purpose. He handled the parts still allergic to artistry, liability, grants with teeth, parents who needed bus passes more than brochures. He had learned not to bring solutions wrapped in pity. He brought transit cards and sat through sign-up lines and asked the registrar to add evening classes for the mothers who clean when everyone else sleeps. His money had begun to move like water through irrigation, quiet, constant, invisible from certain angles, and absolutely essential from others. One evening in late May, Grace slid a folder across his desk. "I want to broaden the work," she said, then flushed because the sentence sounded like audacity when spoken aloud. "Good," he said, even before opening it. He trusted the way her mind made rooms inside logistics. She outlined it in careful strokes. A separate wing focused on mothers and fathers who had fallen through the grid. Daycare stipends, job readiness workshops tuned to real employers. Microgrants with mentors instead of shame. Legal clinics where forms became shields rather than walls. "Music first, always," she added, "but hunger hums too. We have to teach both songs." He turned the last page and found a name at the top, hand-lettered in her steady script, Lantern House. Below it, a line she had written and erased and written again. "Light is a direction as much as a comfort." "Lantern," he echoed, seeing Lydia lighting a candle on hurricane nights, seeing Grace hold a phone flashlight over a feverish forehead. "It's right." "I thought," Grace hesitated, "we could dedicate it to those who taught us to keep a lamp in the window. Your Lydia, my grandmother, not as saints, just as proof." He reached for her hand and did not take it. He set his palm beside hers, an alignment rather than an invitation. "We'll fund it," he said. "We'll staff it. And you'll lead it with your terrifying calm." They began at once. Miss Dupree introduced them to the saints who never make calendars. Women who run intake like triage and prayer. Men who can read a resume and a room at the same time. Architects who owed Ethan favors, turned an abandoned depot near the river into something with dignity. High ceilings, windows that refused to apologize for their light. A playroom that sounded like hope learning percussion. A counseling suite with chairs so decent people felt worthy when they sat down. Above the door they fixed a bronze plaque no bigger than a book. Lydia's light, Elise Holloway's hands. Someone, no one would admit who, placed a single gardenia under it on opening day. Its scent traveled farther than speeches. The ceremony drew a crowd too large for the chairs. Mothers in pressed thrift store blouses, grandfathers in Sunday hats, city officials with ribbon-cutting smiles, teenagers who had learned not to trust until proof arrived in triplicate. Grace did not want to speak and then found she could not keep silence. She stepped to the microphone with that teacher's posture that made rooms align themselves. "Welcome," she said, simple as bread. "This place belongs to all the versions of you. The one who almost came, the one who is here, the one who will return and bring someone else." Her voice didn't swell or tremble. It held. When she finished, Ethan took her place and said fewer words. Second chances aren't charity, he told the room. They're architecture. This is a house. Build with us. They cut the ribbon with oversized scissors that made children laugh. The sound did more than any benediction to bless the building. Stories gathered themselves immediately. A woman with a tattooed ring finger and a grocery store bouquet asked for help drafting a custody agreement that kept her child out of the middle. A boy trying to look older than his 21 years held a flyer for GED classes, like it might lift or burn. A man whose hands shook when he signed his name asked for an application, any application, to anything that didn't ask him for a past he couldn't defend. The intake desk hummed. The playroom became a choir of small, insistent needs, met in order, and without spectacle. In a corner office, Grace sat across from the first microgrant hopeful, a bakery worker who wanted to buy a used commercial mixer and label her bread with her own name. "Bring me your recipes," Grace said. "Bring me your hours. We'll do the math and the music." Word traveled the way it does when news is good enough to doubt, slowly, then all at once. The second week, a familiar shadow fell across the threshold. Tyrone had shaved. He wore a collared shirt too big at the wrists, the nervous dignity of a man who has rehearsed walking into a room that could decide things. He saw Grace at the far end of the hall and flinched as if the past had reached up through the floorboards. She stood before he could find the door again. Their eyes held an entire unshared history, and the small portion they did share. "There's an intake desk," she said, nodding toward it. "They'll treat you with respect and caution. Both are policies." He swallowed hard, jaw tightening. "I ain't here to cause trouble." "I know exactly why you're here," she said. "For once, that's not the problem. Let the people who are trained say what's next." He nodded, and something fragile and unsentimental moved through the air between them. Accountability making room for possibility without pretending to be pardoned. She returned to her office. He took a number like a penitent takes a candle. Not all second chances look like repentance, Grace realized. Some look like paperwork and Tuesday afternoons. A week later, a letter arrived for Ethan on thick stationery that had grown up in older houses. The handwriting was his mother's, immaculate, unsmiling. He read it at his kitchen counter, one hand on the back of a chair as if the words might tilt the room. "You were not wrong to choose life," Margaret had written. "I do not understand your methods. I have been unkind in my ignorance. If this, Lantern House, is your grief made useful, perhaps that is a legacy your father would recognize. I will not stand in the door." At the bottom, a postscript, stiff, reluctant, true. "The children in your photographs look well." He took the letter to Grace and let her read it. She traced the careful loops and imagined the woman who had made them. "It isn't apology," she said, "but it is a step." "Steps are how you cross floors," he answered, and felt the old ache shift its weight. Lantern House found its stride. A calendar bloomed with appointments that held. The Harmony Project braided into it. After-school ensembles rehearsed in the big room. A parenting class learned to set boundaries to a backbeat. An employment fair hired a dozen people in a single morning and hung a bell near the door they could ring when the offer letter arrived. The bell sounded like metal and gratitude in equal measure. On a Saturday, when the river wore its good mood, they hosted a community concert. Children played the first songs they had learned all the way through. A mother recited a poem about a laundromat that felt like a song. Grace accompanied a teenage violinist who leaned into each measure as if the note could hold him. Ethan stood at the back next to Ms. Dupree, who dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief disguised as a lecture towel. "Look at them," she whispered, "learning to belong to themselves." After everyone left and the chairs nested into neat stacks, Grace wandered the quiet halls. The plaque by the door caught the last of the afternoon light, gold where it hadn't been a moment before. She touched it with 2 fingers, not in worship but in thanks. When she turned, Ethan was there, sleeves rolled, tie forgotten in a pocket, the soft collapse of a man who had carried chairs and feelings both. "This is what it is," he said, voice low, as if naming something could make it last. Not the speeches, not the headlines that might come. The room full of people who didn't have to ask permission to sit. And the room, empty, she said, smiling, proving we can trust it to fill again. They stood in the doorway like caretakers and trespassers in equal measure. He extended his hand. Not to lead, but to ask. She placed hers there, not to follow, but to agree. No audience, no music, just the small ceremony of two lives choosing the same corridor. Lit by lamps people before them had taught them to keep lit. Outside, the river turned its wide, unhurried shoulder toward evening. Inside, the building breathed like a body at rest. Second chances are rarely grand, Grace thought. They are foundations poured in quiet, allowed to cure, and strong enough to carry the weight of ordinary joy. The rain returned without apology, as if the city had been holding its breath since the last flood and finally remembered how to exhale. It began with a tremor on the leaves, a rumor across tin roofs, then came honest and whole, sheeting down Decatur, braiding the gutters into quicksilver creeks. In New Orleans, rain is not just weather, it is inheritance. It carries old songs in its ribs. Lantern House went on, as if the sky were merely another guest to seat. Volunteers lined the entry with towels. Children shook their curls like wet sparrows, and someone put a kettle on. In the multi-purpose room, Grace played a steady chord while a class of brand-new cellists counted boldly to 4. The windows fogged at the edges, softening everything to a kind of mercy. Ethan stood near the door, umbrella collapsed and dripping into the mat, watching the building move the way good bodies do, purpose in each limb, breath where it belongs. The rain slurred traffic into a hush. Inside, work sounded like comfort made practical. At the front desk, a woman stepped out of the weather and folded her umbrella with the precise economy of an old habit. Cream coat, pearls, the perfume of a life that had never taken the bus. Margaret Caldwell. She scanned the lobby as one might a foreign country, alert, reserved, determined not to be surprised. When her eyes found Ethan's, something softened, then bristled, then decided. "I brought what you asked for," she said, holding out a weatherproof box. "Lydia's teaching notes. You mentioned the Harmony project needed sample lesson plans." Ethan blinked at the concession of needed. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more widely than the sentence allowed. Margaret's gaze shifted to Grace, who had just finished dismissing the young cellists with instructions to dry their endpins thoroughly, so nothing rusts that doesn't have to. Grace approached, rain on her cuffs like lace. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, and the name held neither edge nor apology. "Miss Holloway," Margaret answered, a fraction steadier than the last time, as if she had practiced saying it in a quiet room. She nodded toward the box. "My daughter-in-law was a meticulous teacher. Perhaps her methods can be of service." Grace's mouth lifted, the measured gratitude of a woman who has learned to receive without debt. "Thank you. Children can feel when a hand has studied how to hold them." Margaret inclined her head. "So I have been told." She hesitated, fingers tightening imperceptibly on the handle of her umbrella. "This," she gestured, taking in the sign, the bustle, the way rain and need coexisted without either demanding center stage. "This work, it is hands-on." "It is hands-on because lives are," Grace replied gently. "Paper helps. People help more." Something like a smile ghosted across Margaret's mouth. "I am learning," she said. "Too late for elegance. Perhaps in time for usefulness." She turned, the coat catching the door's light. "I won't keep you. The weather is taking liberties." When she left, the rain swelled as if to accompany her exit with an orchestra. Ethan looked at Grace, and the look carried bewilderment and relief in equal measure. "She came," he said. "She will come again," Grace answered, "even if only to witness herself being better." The afternoon deepened. Tyrone appeared at the threshold, clean-shaven and damp, the tentative pride of a man who had survived another sober day. He held up a folded paper, a hiring slip from a warehouse upriver. "Ms. Holloway," he said, not stepping farther than welcome. "Your staff helped with the resume. They ain't judged me for the lack between lines." Grace nodded, equal parts formal and kind. "They saw the line in front of you." He tapped the paper once, a small ceremony. "I owe you." "You owe the boys steady days," she said. "The rest is extra." He nodded. Evening gathered in the corners of the building. The final class packed away clarinets with the solemnity of priests. Someone rang the small brass bell at the door when a mother secured a child-care slot that would keep her night shift from collapsing on her hope. The sound threaded the corridors, bright as cutlery. When it was time, they closed. Umbrellas bloomed like cautious flowers along the steps. Ethan offered his to a grandmother with a paper bag of sheet music. He and Grace shared another, small enough that it required them to walk in step. The street glowed the way streets do when they've been reminded of their source, every puddle a rehearsal of the river. "You realize," he said, angling the umbrella to cover her shoulder, "that the city saved this moment for symmetry." He could hear the first night as clearly as if it were present tense, the cracked awning, her voice guarding lullabies, the shape of the word help learning to mean us. "I kept a piece of that night," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small brass key on a ring plain as breath. "Not the night itself, the direction." "Grace, a house," he said, "on the ridge. High ground, wide porch, close enough to hear the river when it's kind. Room for the twins to drum on everything you don't want drummed on." He laughed and the sound didn't break. "I bought it because I could. I kept it empty because I should not fill it without consent." He held the key between them, not closer to her than to himself. "I don't ask for an answer tonight. I'm asking for permission to ask." The rain moved around them like a crowd that had learned to give space. Grace looked at the key as if it might speak, and then at Ethan, as if he already had. In his face there was none of the hunger that had once frightened her, the kind that devours what it loves. There was steadiness. There was making room. "Home is a verb," she said slowly. "It's cooked rice and shoes by the door, and the right to close a room when you need to be only yourself. It is boundaries with welcome stitched in, and children allowed to leave their inventions on the floor for one full day before anyone tidies." "Then the house will learn those rules," he said, "and so will I. And my name remains my name," she added, not defiant but precise. "My work remains my work. My boys remain their own story as much as mine." "Yes," he said, no hesitation. "All yes." She reached out and touched the key with one finger, the way a pianist tests a single note before trusting the whole chord. "I will not move for a promise," she said. "I will move for a pattern. For months of you showing up at daycare sign-outs and bad soup and good counsel, and the grace to let me say no on a Thursday, and yes on a Friday without making either a verdict. Then I will be that pattern," he said. "Not to earn you, no one earns a person, but to deserve the life we might make." A wind came omand and set the rain slantwise. She laughed, the sound people make when fear loosens its grip, and stepped closer under the umbrella. Not to be held, to be near. "You already began," she said. "Tonight, with the key you didn't press into my palm." They walked again, small, synchronous adjustments of shoulder and pace. At Esplanade, the light held them for a breath. The rain softened the city's edges to velvet. "Say it," Grace murmured. Not a command, not a challenge, an invitation to truth. "I love you," Ethan said. It sounded like a sentence that had waited for its punctuation and finally found it. She exhaled, a quiet that felt like a bell rung under the sternum. "I love you," she answered. "Not instead of what came before, because of it, with it, beyond it." No kiss. The rain would have applauded and told everyone. They chose something smaller and more binding. He slipped the key back into his pocket and did not ask her to hold it. She slid her hand into the crook of his elbow, and together they crossed when the light allowed. By the time they reached St. Bridget's, the worst of the weather had spent itself. In the family wing, the twins slept starfish-wide, dreaming the innocent architecture of puddles. Grace stood in the doorway, watching them, while Ethan leaned against the jamb beside her. The room smelled like clean cotton and the faint ghost of rain. Lantern House's bell, 2 neighborhoods away, chimed once, the sound smaller in the distance and still exact. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll bring beignets. We can tell the boys about a porch that might someday belong to their bicycles." "Tomorrow," she agreed, "and many tomorrows after, if the pattern holds." Outside, the rain softened to a blessing. Inside, the future found its shoes and waited by the door. The city, drenched and dazzled, settled into its night music. And in a modest doorway where love had learned to be patient, 2 people chose the next step the way the faithful choose, under the same umbrella, neither leading, neither led, the street shining before them like a promise they refused to hurry. The first morning in the Ridge house arrived with a chorus rather than an alarm. Wrens in the camellias, a barge horn throwing its slow benediction upriver, the twins discovering the acoustics of a wooden hallway and announcing that footsteps can be drums if you believe hard enough. The porch held a small galaxy of drying sneakers. A chalk crown bloomed on the top step, evidence that someone had already declared sovereignty. Ethan brewed coffee that tasted faintly of relief and poured it into mugs that did not match and never would. Grace moved through the kitchen with her unhurried competence, reading labels, tucking spices into a drawer by flavor instead of alphabet, blessing the room with a new logic. On the counter, a small brass key rested, no longer a question but not quite a relic. It glinted when the sun found it, an asterisk beside the sentence they had chosen together. They had not staged a ceremony. No aisle watchers. Instead, signatures at the recorder's office, a lunch of red beans, and a walk through each room where Grace named what would live there. A table that forgives spills. A shelf that holds sheet music and apology in equal measure. A corner for silence when one of us has too many words. Ethan wrote the names on sticky notes and left them where he could trip on them and obey. Margaret came on a Sunday with peonies bound in brown paper, her pearls dimmed by rain. She stood on the porch and looked, as if the house might answer a question she didn't yet know how to ask. When Ethan opened the door, she lifted her chin. "I would like to see where you intend to put the piano," she said, as if the piano could make everything respectable by association. Inside, the twins presented her with a drawing of our family plus grandma and a trumpet. And Margaret, who had practiced many kinds of restraint, failed at one. She laughed. It was a sound with edges, but it was also a start. Lantern House thrummed into summer. The Harmony Project spilled brass and bravery into school gyms. A choir formed without anyone deciding to call it that. Tyrone wore a name badge to his new shifts and learned the precise grammar of forklifts. The Microgrant Bakery filled a glass case with bread that tasted like a door left open for you. Ms. Dupree acquired a bell with a better tone. It rang often enough that the building learned to keep joy in stock. On the house's wide porch, evenings became a liturgy. Grace graded lesson plans. Ethan tuned the old upright they'd rescued from a church sale. Micah and Malcolm raced scooters from Azalea to Mailbox and back, their competition fierce and generous. Sometimes a teenager from Lantern House sat on the steps and tried a stubborn chord progression. Sometimes Margaret arrived with Lydia's teaching notes carefully tabbed and left with 2 jars of Grace's sweet tea, testifying to a peace built in inches. In the blue hour, when the sky held both heat and forgiveness, Grace's lullaby traveled from the nursery like a ribbon looping the roof to the ground, tying the whole. "You know what I love about this sound?" Ethan asked one night, the tune threading the dark. "It's the first thing I've ever heard that makes the house feel like it's breathing." "It is," Grace said. "Houses breathe through the people who insist on being tender in them." They did the small work that makes a life. Grocery lists written with jokes in the margins. Calendars negotiated like delicate treaties, the odd ache acknowledged before it could turn to myth. They fought once over nothing and twice over something. Both learned how to step back before stepping close. When Ethan faltered, old fear flashing its teeth at the word forever, Grace touched his cheek and said, "Love is not a memorial, Ethan. It is a table with more chairs." When school returned, Lantern House hosted a harvest evening. Lights strung across the lot turned the asphalt into a celestial map designed for dancing. Children played the first songs that could hold outside. Mothers sang harmonies that ached with history and bright tomorrow. The bakery's proprietor passed slices by hand. Tyrone handed out folding chairs like absolution. Margaret stood by the lemonade urn and asked a teenage violinist about rosin with such interest that the girl blushed. Ethan found Grace near the bell, her dress the color of dusk, her eyes bright with a satisfaction that prefers verbs over nouns. He took her hand with the reverence of first gestures and the ease of practiced ones. "Dance with me?" he asked. "To your tempo," she teased, then followed his lead and corrected it, which is the only choreography worth learning. They moved under lights that pretended to be stars and did not get caught. The twins inserted themselves between their knees and made the waltz into a 4-beat stomp. Applause arrived from the one place applause matters, a cluster of kids who had just learned to be proud without permission. He kissed her then, not as surprise, not as punctuation, a sentence well made accepting its period. The kiss said, more. The kiss said, again. The kiss said, we are still a chorus even when we're singing alone. Later, when the last chair nested in the bell's side, they walked home by way of the levee. The river lay long and sure at their side. The city laid its bright cheek on their shoulder. Grace slipped her hand into Ethan's pocket and reclaimed, just for a moment, the brass key. She balanced it on her palm as if weighing an egg. Do you ever think about that first night? She asked. Every time it rains, he said. Every time it doesn't. We mistook rescue for salvation, she said, smiling, and learned that the best salvation is partnership. And pattern, he added. All those ordinary days that refused to be small. They stopped at the crest and looked toward the house that had learned their names. Behind its windows, two small boys argued in their sleep about who got to be the louder train. In its doorway, a pair of scuffed shoes waited for tomorrow. On its piano, Lydia's notes and Grace's lullaby shared a music stand without envying each other. Home is a verb, Grace said again, because some truths earn repetition. It is, Ethan answered, and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and did not let go. The years to come would widen the table. Mentees turned mentors. A foster baby with a soft thunder of hair. Margaret's hands steadying as she showed Micah how to cut peonies without scolding the ants. There would be storms and paperwork, and the long patience of building anything worth keeping. There would be laughter from rooms no architect had planned. There would be grief in new shapes and courage borrowed in old ones. Through all of it, the house would breathe and the bell would ring, and the river would say, every day, continue. And love would do what it always does when it is given space and stewardship. It would multiply, not like numbers, not like trophies, but like light traveling window to window, like songs picked up by children who do not yet know the words, like bread split in half that leaves both halves somehow larger. If this story found you in a quiet hour and kept you company, let it keep traveling. Share your favorite moment in the comments so others can find it. Tap the heart if you felt the music in these rooms, and follow the channel to stay with us as we build more chapters where second chances become first choices. Your voice helps this little community ring the bell a little louder and makes room at the table for the next person who needs a seat.